Welcome to the podcast, The Other Woman and the Wife, where we discuss why infidelity exists and what we can learn from it. In today's episode, we are going to go into a deep dive discussion around whether you choose discovery or disclosure. And I think every day that you are not disclosing, you are choosing discovery. And I think that there is a lot to consider when you are making the choice to disclose, and we are going to get right into it. And Anne-Marie, you have been so instrumental in getting me to talk about topics that previously I wouldn't even consider disclosing my opinion because I was so nervous about what my opinion could do to the world. But now I am definitely stepping into, if not me, then who? Nobody?
Just here.
Like
just here to push boundaries. That's all we're doing.
I love it. Yeah, you're really pressing the bounds of my comfort zone, and I really appreciate it. And you had done a lot of research on this particular episode. And so if you could just give us a brief overview of what it is that we're going to be talking about and sharing with the listeners and what our hope is.
So it's always debated whether discovery or disclosure, which one's more risky. And of course, every situation is different. But there seems to be a lot of push that disclosure is always the best way. And I'm not saying that I'm not prone to agree, especially if you're trying to recover a marriage or the primary relationship. But I think it's important that we open the discussion up a little bit wider and we talk about how to prepare yourself for disclosure, healthy ways to approach it. And if there are situations that are worth discussing that maybe wouldn't put disclosure in the primary way of handling the situation.
Absolutely. And we had a very interesting conversation, unplanned. What was it, yesterday, with the lady that helps me with my appearance, my visual appearance on the internet. And she had a personal story with betrayal and loss. And it was really interesting, you and I having that conversation with her in the room, because she also had an opinion that I think was really, really valuable. And in her story, it was her partner's, spouse, partner. I can't remember if they were married or not, but her partner's affair partner was the one who had put pressure on the relationship to get him to do something different. And basically, she had been posting photos of them out and about, and that ultimately resulted in discovery. And we had talked to her about, what was that like for her? What would have been less traumatizing for her in that event? And it was really interesting kind of watching her talk about that so openly with us in an environment where she felt safe, even considering the topic with the two of us. So I thought that was really, really interesting.
It's always great when we can broaden the conversation with someone who was betrayed and is willing to have those conversations.
Absolutely. So let's go ahead and get into the pros and cons of discovery and disclosure. And I think we can talk about the risk of discovery, the risks that you're probably not considering because you are so pent up with anxiety and fear and paranoia. I think that the risk that comes along with discovery is you lose control of the narrative. And ultimately, if you discover information that violates your understanding of your current reality, you're going to come up with a lot of stories inside of your head as to what actually happened. And I'm speaking from the betrayed's perspective. So if I were to stumble upon Stan's Apple Watch and see a flood of text messages come through from someone I don't know, but the content of their conversation is violating to what my understanding of our relationship, I imagine that I would probably initially, in a very reactive way, go into a space where, what does all of this mean? And Does this mean that he never loved me? Does this mean that he just sees me as an inanimate object to fulfill whatever he's getting from the relationship? So I think it's really important to consider the fact that if your infidelity is discovered, you lose absolute control over the story that your spouse is going to be telling themselves about what has occurred.
Yeah, and something I hadn't really been thinking about is my brain always goes to when you're waiting for discovery, there's so many other humans that can lead to that discovery. But I hadn't even thought about how you're actually giving power to the inanimate objects in your life, like your phone and your Apple Watch, and how like they even have power over you now because that discovery through those tools is always lingering as a thing that could happen. I was always just so like thinking about this topic as it being the risk of somebody else telling them for you.
Totally. And I think that, what you just honed in on is giving power to tools that those tools, they weren't created to give power over you. They were created to be helpful to you. So if you are fearing the tools that exist, you might get to a place where you start to resent them. Oh my God, I can't believe my Apple Watch, right? Like I remember, because there was definitely a event of discovery within my own infidelity and me feeling like, oh my gosh, I should have never written that email. I should have never even used my phone. I started to resent my phone, and that went to resenting myself. And I just think that moving through resentment is probably one of the most powerful things that a human can do to grapple with the understanding of the world that they live in and whether that resentment actually serves any purpose. And maybe that resentment came to be because you don't understand how to utilize these tools to your benefit and what they were created for.
I agree.
And then let's go ahead and talk about the risks of disclosure. What do you think the risks are to disclosure?
The risks of disclosure would definitely be lack of preparation and sharing too much. Those situations are so heightened. And I know in my experience, my immediate reaction was that I now needed to be an open book. Once I had disclosed, I had to answer any questions. And that was like, that's the least I could do to show respect for my spouse at that time. And when I look back on it, it's like, wow, that conversation could have went so different if I would have just been like, I need to give you this information, and then we need to take a minute before we decide which questions to talk about and answer. And I know when I was looking on the TikTok and I was looking for what other people thought on this topic, there was such a heavy hand that, yes, the wayward spouse now needs to be an open book and answer all the questions. But in a way, it's almost like when they start using that as their own self-harm tool, digging for answers. Because the more I thought about it, the more I was like, I think people, they want to know and they want to piece it all together because they're looking for their own fault in the situation. And they're having trouble stepping back and seeing that it had nothing, yes, there was disconnection in the marriage, but the connection between the betrayer and the affair partner, that is the part that didn't have anything to do with you. That was a them thing, not a you thing. The disconnection in the marriage is a you thing. You can focus on that, but finding out every detail of the affair isn't going to answer the questions that you're looking to answer.
Absolutely. I also think that when you are prying for information that isn't yours, if you're prying into somebody else's reality to give you answers about your own reality, you're looking at the wrong source. And I also think that when you go on this mission of like, oh my gosh, I need to get all of these questions answered in order for me to move forward, I think sometimes if you're angry and you're looking for the information as to why you're angry within somebody else's story, you're just looking for reasons to perpetuate that anger and animosity. I have come across thousands of betrayed spouses who go on this surveillance mission of their partner and thinking that, if they just can keep tabs on this person, then they will have this illusion of control and have visibility into something that they don't understand. But I don't think that you can gather understanding by running surveillance on another person's life, because I am a strong believer of not consuming information that wasn't intended for me. So whenever I go into, some people often will send me screenshots of their personal conversations with somebody else without, there being any type of permission to disclose this conversation with me. And I've definitely had to learn my lesson in this a few times within this business, because when you send me a screenshot, but a private conversation between you and this other person, the only thing I really want to be looking at is what you're saying, because you're the one I'm talking to, not necessarily this other person. And I think that we violate each other quite often in pursuit of justice or fairness or understanding. But ultimately, to violate somebody else's privacy does nothing good for you, I don't think. If they're not asking you or inviting your influence into this particular personal decision, there's a reason. There is a reason that you are not being invited into that conversation. And I think in order for a relationship to thrive, you kind of have to have respect for autonomy and understanding when that information is relevant to you and your discovery or not. I think that our obsession with information that affects us but doesn't necessarily impact the way that we live or negatively impacts the way that we live is pretty profound, and it goes unnoticed a lot of the time.
What you just said about autonomy, it made me think of how it feels like it's an attempt to go after their autonomy because they hurt you in your autonomy. And when that's the behavior that you immediately resort to, that's a really sure sign that that relationship is probably not going to be getting recovered, because that's such a tit for tat mindset of like, well, you violated our relationship, and so I can violate your space now.
It goes into a competition and less of a relationship.
And the people I've heard, the most recent defenses I've heard for this behavior is that I just needed to know all the details so that I had everything I needed to leave. So if you aren't sure if you want to leave, then going and looking through that information is a sure sign way to make that actually come about. That's for sure.
If you're actually violating somebody else's autonomy.
Yeah. If you're actually like going through their personal things, looking for the evidence, especially if you aren't willing to have the conversation, but you are willing to go through their things to find the information, that's just, to me, that's a big red flag that therapy might not end up working for you, for your situation.
And also the strategies you're deploying probably aren't working for you.
Yeah.
So we got to change our strategies for sure.
Mm-hmm.
So I think whenever it comes to answering the questions of the betrayed party, it's not you are welcome to ask. I think that the most helpful way to pursue this particular topic is to be in the mindset of they can ask me whatever questions they want to, but then I need time to discern why I would answer that question ever. Why would anyone have the right to a story that isn't their own? So when I think about how this one time I posted a TikTok and I was brutally honest in the TikTok, and it was like Elise Myers doing that one collaboration with that guy. Do you know which one I'm talking about? Chronically Cautious?
Yes. I listened to that one so much.
Right? And the lyrics were So if I'm honest, I think I'm beginning to question how much I want this. Overloaded serial stressor. I'm sitting nauseous, panic on a loop in my head. I'm chronically cautious. And I did a TikTok to this bit, and I put the phrasing on it: when he left his wife and bought you a house and you're second guessing if you still want to be inside the relationship. This was definitely a very real experience for me. And this woman had commented and she said, sometimes brutal honesty is more brutal than it is honest. And I was like, oh, I never thought about it like that. Complete transparency isn't the same as being honest. And sometimes an honest answer is, that is information that I'm not willing to give you. I do not see how giving that information to you, produces healing for you. I do not see how providing that information for you produces any type of productivity for me in this situation. And we really just need to understand what we, as the couple, the individuals inside the couple, need to do going forward. If we are going to forego the relationship and move on, then is answering questions like, how many times did you sleep with her? Or questions like, did you love her more than me? Like all of the questions that we ask, we really need to consider the question that we ask more important than the answers that we are given. So I think really understanding the core of what is at that question for the person who is asking that question, right? Did you love her more than me? Is my worth founded in whether this person loves me a certain amount, and would they ever be able to prove it? I think that question is probably pointless. There's no value in answering that question.
Yeah. When I was looking this stuff up, I was getting a lot of what the betrayed community, what their methods are for getting these questions answered. And I will say that probably if you do reach an impasse where it's like, I just want to know this information, and you've already said, I'm not comfortable sharing that information, that would be a great time to bring in a third party. That would be a good time to go to therapy and be like, okay, if you want the answer to this question, we're going to do it, but we're going to do it with a professional around, because those are not the types of wounds that should be ripped open when you're all by yourself with just the other emotionally hurt person.
Yes, absolutely. I do think that the third party is super important too. If you are in any type of situation where you feel unsafe with your partner, if they have exhibited behaviors of violence or, just negative interactions in general, then maybe this is not a private conversation. Maybe this is a private conversation with a third party who can help to alleviate some of the emotional discomfort that is going to be felt in these conversations.
Yeah. And I would say that puts another, like, the pro to disclosing is that you have the time to think about what you need, if you need that third party or if you don't need that third party. And if you choose not to disclose, then all that power is given away. Then you don't know how that situation is going to end up playing out. And you have to accept that, which involves a lot of compartmentalizing. And I would say that would definitely go into one of the hugely negative effects of not disclosing is giving all that power away. Would be in my experience, it was definitely the physical and mental toll. Thinking that I could compartmentalize it, thinking I could take it to my grave, thinking that it was for the good of everyone, and really doing it in like a self-sacrificing mindset of this information is only going to hurt a lot of people. And then the way that showed up, always not having that power, it shows up in autoimmune diseases and gut issues and joint issues and poor eating habits. And it just perpetuates your own anxiety and stress. Like, you're the creator of that anxiety and stress when you're leaving all of that out for just the universe.
And it's so interesting because one of the thoughts that comes to me whenever you talk about that is, ultimately, I think that is the result of harboring deception. And it's not necessarily deception with others, but it's deception with yourself, within yourself, right? Like you saying that I had it in my mind that I could take this with me to the grave, but it was eating away at my physical and mental vitality. That is the biggest consequence of the stigma and stereotype that surrounds the infidelity conversation. I think it's, we are constantly obsessed with how we are impacting the world and the deception that we may have created externally, when really it's an internal existence that needs to be addressed.
Yeah. And no matter how good you are at compartmentalizing it, the fact that your brain is still going to interpret it as shame. I think it's going to ultimately, your brain, your body is going to interpret it as shame, because if there's a part of you that you can't be honest about, your brain wants to know. Like, why can't you be honest about this part? Is there something wrong with this part? Your brain is going to want to figure it out because it's a part of you. The secret is a part of you. And so until you can get to the place of saying the thing, then your brain's like, oh, we can release that shame because we said it, and now we can move forward from it. Shame is another one that just causes these physical and mental things to plague you, essentially. And yeah, I think that's, no matter how good you are at telling yourself that it's not affecting you, that shame is still sitting in the back of your head.
I love that you said telling yourself, because I feel like a lot of people don't realize how much self-talk impacts the way that they exist inside of the world. And so even you, right, telling yourself, I can take this to my grave. But innately, the struggle against that is, no, you can't. No, you can't. And so the whole deception with ourselves is so paramount to this entire conversation, because I think you end up in a world when you're in the midst of infidelity of what's real, what's not. This wasn't supposed to happen, but it's definitely happening. So do I just pursue a double life? And is that the easiest option for me?
If you are the other woman in your relationship and you love this podcast, you would love the Other Women community. The Other Women community is a membership program designed to help other women just like you reclaim their relationship with themselves and heal from their affair. We provide a safe and supportive environment for you to open up and talk about your experiences. We give you the tools and resources you need to grow into an authentic, empowered individual. If you're ready to take the next step in your healing journey, head on over to theotherwomanandthewife.com/community to learn more about the membership and all it has to offer.
Okay, so let's get into the mental gymnastics of it all. Because when we put ourselves into a place of neurosis, essentially, which neurosis is a relatively mild mental illness that is not caused by organic disease, involving symptoms of stress, depression, anxiety, and obsessive behavior, but not a radical loss of touch with reality. So I think we get to a place where the mental gymnastics actually come into play. We start to obsess. People will consider someone in an affair doing mental gymnastics to justify or validate the existence of the affair. And I don't think it's that at all. I think the mental gymnastics are when we are obsessing about our next step instead of taking it. And ultimately, that puts you into a place where you're living your life, where you're actually doing gymnastics rather than mental gymnastics, to stop yourself from doing what it is you need to do next.
Yeah. If you think about any problem long enough, you'll come up with just as many reasons or just as many scenarios that it can go wrong as it can go right. Especially if you aren't very good at putting yourself in the driver's seat, then if you're always trying to figure out which solution will be less harmful, you'll always be able to come up with how other people are going to react that are going to make you uncomfortable.
Absolutely. And I think whenever you're hyper-focused on how somebody else is going to react, you're ultimately trying to control their emotional state. So one of the ways that I feel like I finally let go of a lot of past narratives that were stuck inside of my head, such as divorce indicates failure and all of that, was giving people the opportunity to be themselves, even with my reality in place. So letting go was effectively letting go of the control that wasn't mine to have in the first place. Letting go of how this person was going to respond in the wake of information that was going to drastically change the future reality they had baked inside of their mind about my existence and my participation. So I think the letting other people come into their own autonomy requires you to allow that experience to come to be.
Yes, 100%. So I feel like we definitely are in agreement that there will be consequences for trying to keep it inside, and that disclosing, especially if you're trying to maintain your primary relationship, is the ideal route. But what I wish I would have had was more conversation about how to prepare yourself to disclose instead of just waiting for it to slowly spill out of me in what was a more harmful than helpful way.
I have heard so many stories of women in affairs who do this thing called a trickle truth, where they're having a moment with their spouse, they're actively in an affair, they are enjoying the moment that they're having with their spouse, and they feel like they can get to a vulnerable place. And what they do is they speak a little bit of their truth. So they'll say something like, just really difficult for me to be happy lately. And then the spouse's reaction to that instance is, are you ever going to be happy? If you just need to move on, just move on. And there's this really negative reaction, and that causes the other person to completely shut down. So being prepared for, disclosure, I think requires you knowing what you are ready to share and what you are not ready to share, and being super clear about that, because ultimately it is your truth. You can expose all of it if you want to. I did that. I don't think it was the best way to go. I think that I could have been more compassionate in the delivery of that information. So whenever I think about if I were to be back in that place of preparing myself for disclosure, I would want to keep the focus on how I could compassionately remove myself from the relationship without sharing information that would be detrimental to this person's well-being. Now, if they want to go and pursue information that is going to be detrimental to their well-being, that's kind of on them. I did not actively share that information with them. But for me to just put it all out there and callously, I think I was pretty callous in my delivery of the information, and I didn't give him an option. It was direct. It was brutally honest. And had I taken the time to really sit down and think about what it is that I needed to share with this particular person, and it being less about what I thought they needed and more about what I felt I needed, then that would have been ideal. Because then I'm basically trying to give them everything I'm projecting that they think they need. Because my understanding at that time was, if I give him all the information, then he'll understand why I had to leave the relationship. But his understanding wasn't based on what information I gave him. His understanding is based on his own existence. And I didn't have control over his understanding.
And their interpretation,
Their lens of perception.
Their lens of perception, which has everything to do with their internal monologue, which we could never guess what's going on in somebody else's mind. And I know the other thing I would say is something that I wish that I would have had the story straighter in my own head, because I think my solving how I felt, I was in such denial that the affair had been a learning experience, and I was trying to tuck it away as a mistake, that when I told my spouse, I disclosed everything honestly at that time, But then over the next few years, as I went to therapy, I think it probably to him felt like a trickle truth situation because I kept making these discoveries about myself. And as I started shedding the shame, I started being like, there was a little bit more to it. And I look back and I wish I had just done that work more privately and that I had been more confident in therapy and my own ability to find the answers and then come back to him in like a more healed format. Because I don't think that it was helpful, like doing all of this digging by myself and then thinking I'm going to go and be honest with him now because if I feel obligated to, because we're still working on things.
Absolutely. I also think, what you just touched on is the whole, I need to understand what actually happened before I answer these questions, right? Like if you're at a place where you really don't understand how the affair came to be or what it meant to you, then getting an external, unbiased, objective point of view, I think is incredibly powerful in that place in life. I also think that disclosure to a partner that you do love, that you sincerely love, requires that you disclose to someone other than them first. I do not think that they are the first person you disclose to. And the reason I don't think this is because then it just becomes a reactionary conversation. It does not become an intentional conversation. It becomes a heat of the moment. And we all know what happens in the heat of the moment. A lot of emotional dysregulation. So if you, get a coach, a therapist, I really struggle to say a friend or a family member because these people will have their own personal biases and motives and their own relationship with you that they may reconsider if you were to be this vulnerable with them. And I definitely am a believer that not everybody is deserving of your personal truth. And having the confidence to get the help that you need and the right kind of help requires you to ask for it. So I think in preparation for disclosure, you really you have to actually open up. And that's so hard for people to do when they're in the midst of an affair because, I just remember thinking that if anybody knew that I had transgressed in this way, I would be meaningless or like without purpose.
Well, I was going to say, because we were talking about coaching and you had mentioned something that you had been really focusing on with some of your coaching clients that I actually found really helpful. It's just a helpful way to think when you're preparing to have the conversations about the You can elaborate on it, but having a collaborative conversation.
Oh yeah, are we having an informative conversation or is this a collaborative conversation? So I think when I speak to people within the coaching program, I ask them, okay, so you want to have this conversation with them. What is the intention behind it? And if the intention is to alleviate your guilt, sorry, that's not going to happen. You actually need to process the guilt and understand where it stems from. If your intention is to, like my intention with the whole thing of disclosure was to make sure I wasn't revoking the only power that this person that I loved at a time in my life, I wasn't the one revoking it from them. I truly do believe that the only power we have in this world is the power of choice. And I was revoking his understanding of his future reality and my future reality. And we sincerely cared for each other. So when I talk to the women and the men, I talk about being mindful of your intention in the conversation, not only before the conversation happens, but also while it's happening. Otherwise, that reactionary behavior comes into play. So I think also, decisions are made inside of your head before they are ever disclosed to somebody else or even acted upon.
I definitely never think about, I always feel like once I open the conversation, it's a collaboration. And I had never thought about putting that boundary up just when you start engaging. I was raised with this mentality. They call it the Midwest goodbye. It's like you can never leave somebody's house because you gotta you say goodbye and then you mention the next thing and then you're there for another hour. When you mentioned that, that stuck with me because I was like, oh, wow, I thought all conversations were collaborative once you open that door.
All conversations, right? All conversations, if you are having a conversation with someone, you are inviting their influence into your life. So if you are already decided inside of your head that I'm going to exit this relationship and I'm going to do X, Y, and Z before I do, and then you go to have a conversation, and instead of it being an informative one, this is what creates that whole ping pong effect, this whole infidelity repeating itself inside of the same partnership. I think it's the negligence of understanding what the intent is in communicating with your partner. You can have conversations, you can have informative statements. I think that I spent a lot of time trying to understand why humans even communicate in the first place. We have these bodies and these mouths and these brains and these thoughts, and it all just kind of comes out, and it's literally air moving through my mouth. What is the intention behind this? What is the purpose of me being able to speak and use my voice? And it's, to realize my actual existence in the world. But if I'm reckless with that ability, is it really serving its purpose? And I think that we can be super responsible with this ability and being able to drive decisions that are meaningful to us. Because if I go into a conversation to tell you that I cheated on you and I'm leaving the relationship, and then you tell me, no, please wait, I just invited your influence into that decision. And now I'm going to renege on that decision. So am I doing myself a disservice based on your pleas? Probably.
Yeah. I'll be thinking about that one for a while.
Oh, shit. Sorry, Anne-Marie.
It's okay. It's all good. I'm here to learn. I'm here to expand my mind, think new ways. So then it kind of, the way that we ended up leading this is to discuss whether disclosure or discovery is an absolute. Because it's definitely spoken about as an absolute out in the internet world, at the very least. As
really?
It's going to be, I mean, everything I was finding was saying that one way or another, it's gonna come out.
I mean, I remember during Gangstergate, they had said at one point, whenever we were negotiating with them, because whatever, cowards didn't want their identity to be released, but they had said, we covered our tracks so well, she'll never be able to prove it's us. And I thought about that statement for a really long time. It happened, but I'll never be able to prove who did it. And I just think that there's too much of a digital footprint to say that that statement is actually true. If you did it, it can be proved that you did it. And whether, the forces that be bring it to light or not is outside of your control. So if you're working to get your power back into your life, then you are relinquishing that aspect of your story to something outside of you. And I think that that's partly why I kind of started this whole thing, because I was like, nobody's actually speaking from the perspective of the person who participated. And I think that is the missing link in the conversation to promote actual peace and understanding among people.
I think it's kind of funny how so much opinion on this topic has been formulated with such a key player out of the conversation, because whatever they have to say is indefensible. So they just don't talk. That's the energy I felt. That was the energy that kept me from ever engaging with.
Also, all of those conversations weren't firsthand accounts. They were speculation. And that bothered the shit out of me, because I was like, the only person who can really tell you what their motive is the person who is acting in that way. So if you're sitting there and you're just speculating, you're actually still perpetuating the thing of telling people who they are rather than allowing them to tell you who they are. And I think that that is where we fundamentally went wrong as humanity, is constantly telling people who they are and who they should be, rather than allowing them to discover it for themselves and allowing them to speak for themselves.
I did come across a video on TikTok, and it was a woman so they were reading a script that was written by a real person. And the statement was that I had a 7-month affair at the beginning of my marriage, and I don't regret it. And then they went into explaining how while they were planning their wedding, it was really stressful. And they had a job interview and they didn't take the job, but they had really connected with the person putting the interview on. And after they had gone through with their marriage and they were really quite unhappy, they met again at the same restaurant that they had done their interview at. And so over time, they started to talk more, and then they started to meet up, and they were both married and they both weren't looking for anything long term. But what happened was her husband, she stopped caring about what he was doing. If he wanted to play video games instead of hang out with her, that was fine. She just went and hung out with her affair partner. Or what ended up happening was she realized that as she didn't care as much about how he responded to what she was doing, the more time she found herself just occupying her own time and making more friends. And it was just no expectation. Do you want to hang out with me? No, you don't? Okay. And what he noticed was she was content without him. And that actually is what lit the fire under him to be like, well, I want to get in on this too. I want to get in on this contentment thing that you have going on over here. And so he just organically started wanting to do more with her. And in the story, it was basically that the two married people, they disengaged and they went back to their marriages, and her marriage improved, and they've been married now for 15 years and they're happy. But she doesn't regret that learning experience in her early marriage because it brought about such a positive thing. And now she has a really strong relationship with her husband. But it was the realization so early in the marriage that his response doesn't matter. She can still have a good time.
Her expectations should not dictate what he does. I absolutely love that story because, once he sees that she actually has this level of contentment, he's like, oh, I actually want that. Because I think the last thing we really want to do is pressure other people into decisions that they don't want to make innately. And when we're doing that, we are projecting our own worldview, our own values, our own beliefs onto a person who isn't us. And we don't need to be duplicated. There's no need for another Chelsea. There's no need for another Anne Marie. We are all concentrated in our individual existences for a reason. And I think we miss that so often because we spend so much time telling other people what to do, instead of just being there with them and partnering with them when they're trying to figure out what their next step is.
Yeah. And when I heard that story, it rang so true. Yeah, my expectation was that my husband was going to want to spend every waking moment with me. And then when that wasn't ultimately how it works, because that's just not how it works.
Or even what he wanted to do, right?
Or even what I wanted.
Yeah. Absolutely.
You know? And
why do I want this thing?
Yeah, but it was I think it's because culturally it was just communicated that the goal was marriage and then you had your spouse. There's this dropping off of all these other really important relationships and other forms of love that just aren't promoted to us as primary and important.
Absolutely. The identity of being married is so heavily emphasized by our upbringing that we don't understand how it actually works against our fulfillment. And whenever I think about, there are people in really tricky situations in the world, right? You're in a marriage and your spouse has had a terminal illness for the last 10 years, and you are missing parts of your experience of fulfillment because this person can no longer participate with you in life the way that you can. There is a imbalance, right? Does that mean that you should get a divorce? I don't think so. I really don't. I think that there are a lot of creative options to come up with that will require uncomfortable communication, which you have to be willing to go there. And I think about our group, our insiders group, and I'll go ahead and start to introduce this to the listeners. I have plucked a few people from the community that I've known for over a year. And I really respect these individuals, not just for who they are, but also their opinions on the subject matter. And I think that encompassing their thoughts will be super helpful while they're not at a place to reveal their identities on the podcast or have any interest. I have asked them if they are willing to let me vocalize some of their opinions because I find them incredibly thought-provoking and profound. We had asked them on their thoughts about discovery or disclosure needing to be an absolute. I think that with discovery looming in the trenches, there's a bit of paranoia at play. And I don't want anyone to have a paranoid existence. I feel like paranoia and fear run hand in hand. And the only way to dissipate that experience for yourself is to stand in the way of fear and do things that create a fearlessness inside of you. And so we asked them, is disclosure or discovery absolutely necessary in the experience of infidelity? Yeah. An affair exists as a secret, and the only two people on the planet know about it, and it never actually creating the psychological havoc that occurs when new information is learned. Because I always found this really perplexing because it was like a lot of the marriages continue to exist simultaneously with the affair being in existence. And ultimately, I think what's traumatizing about learning that your story encompasses infidelity is the reaction to it. And it's not really the infidelity itself because everyone was happy-go-lucky before they actually learned the information. It's the new knowledge that kind of creates the existence inside of your head that you don't want to be there, basically. And so I think if you are the wayward spouse and you want the outcome to be that your marriage moves through the experience of infidelity, then you actually do need to give your spouse the opportunity to display to you their ability to love you through it and truly heal the connection as a couple. Because I think any connection that requires an individual to deceive themselves or others around them, not being able to reveal yourself and your truth speaks to an inauthentic connection. I remember, right after the affair, I became obsessed with authenticity and why people do the things that they do. And I think that if you are perpetuating an inauthentic experience, you are going to remain in a state of fearing who you really are. And if you fear who you really are you allowing other people to love who you really are? I think that's what this really comes down to. Am I willing to give my spouse the opportunity to change their mind about me, change their mind about the existence of the relationship? Am I going to give them their right to autonomy? But there's also, those of us who are already decided against continuing the relationship. And if you're in an affair and you've already decided that perpetuating the primary partnership or the partnership that predates the existence of the affair relationship, I don't think there's much value in full disclosure. I think enough needs to be said to help the betrayed spouse understand that the relationship is coming to an end and it is not repairable, but not enough information to cause them significant harm. There just isn't a need to hurt them that deeply, especially if the relationship is already over.
I was definitely in agreement with the insiders on this one, that it would just be harmful if the relationship is already ending to be like, oh, and by the way, on my way out.
Oh, God. I seriously wish I had these girls. I was talking with one of my favorite people on the planet this morning, actually. We were talking about the existence of the community because she had sent me a TikTok basically talking about her own female influences in her life, in early life, I guess. I don't know. Basically, the women that were around her. I told her, I said, one thing I'm noticing about the community is it's a wealth of feminine wisdom and mystique. I did not have well-connected relationships with healthy females growing up. And she had wrote back and she goes, oh my God, if I would have had a mom like some of the women inside of our community, I think my life would have panned out very differently earlier. And I think that not only is there disconnection in our primary partnerships, but there is disconnection with other people in general. If you think about COVID, the entire, I'll say the consequence of COVID wasn't necessarily death, but it was disconnection with people. We were completely compartmentalized, right? We went from enmeshment, where we're all having affairs in the workplace, to then going into a compartmentalization state of being. And we saw a huge increase in divorces because all of a sudden you're being forced to spend time inside of a connection that you don't want to be in. You don't have the escape anymore. You don't have the workplace to go to. And I think that when we allow ourselves to connect with people, new people, especially when we find ourselves inside of an affair, that is one of the most powerful places to be.
Yeah, for sure. And then COVID, just to make it worse, we all had to work alongside each other. We had to take our work home. We had to figure out how you were going to organize your work days with the other person that now had to be there and participate as well in lots of situations.
Oh my God. Coexisting for that duration of time. Stan is coming off of a 1-month work trip and I'm about to go on a work trip. And it's funny how much I look forward to our reunions. It's almost, I like that we get time apart because we have new stories and new experiences to share with one another. That reunion is something that I look forward to. Whereas I'll say that in past romantic relationships, it was always like, could I delay? Could I delay my homecoming? Could I just not go home for a little bit? And I felt like that was a huge thing that I overlooked for a long time inside of my life.
Yeah, that was something I realized pretty early on because in the military, it was all about getting out so that we could stop saying goodbye for months at a time. And then after a couple of years of being out, I was like, we should really make a few scenarios where we get to miss each other, don't you think? I think that'd be really great for us, actually. But the way that you think it's going to be and then the way that it goes, not always the same.
Fantasy and reality, right?
Fantasy and reality.
If you're struggling with the decision to disclose, I am an open book, and I think a lot of the women inside of the community are helpful. And I'll go ahead and do a plug right here because I know there are a lot of men who listen, and we are getting that men's community up and running. So we're going to do a copy paste with a different face. We have Coach Luke coming in to kind of be the face of that community. And we'll also have a space where men and women who are participating in an affair, who are looking for no judgment and support in seeking their next steps, where they can kind of collaborate together. Because I think often we are struggling with just not enough context to make a decision that is meaningful to us. So I'm super stoked about the men's community coming up and running, and I'll be in there occasionally. But mostly, I think that Luke will be able to offer a male perspective that is differing than mine because I am not a male. So yeah,
Just with having mentioned Luke, will you elaborate what his role was in his own experience with infidelity?
Luke was the betrayed husband, and it was I believe it was a family friend of theirs. They ended up parting ways. The marriage dissolved. And then 10 years, I think, went by, and now they are actively recreating a different relationship because 10 years goes by and you are a different person. And Luke is really, my episode with him, it's so funny because the entire time we were recording the episode, it was like, God, the experience of the betrayer and the betrayed like mirrors each other so like to the T. But it's interesting because there's only one person that we'd like to fault. And he very much came at it from the perspective of infidelity is separate from the connection that is built within a marriage. Like those two things are far apart. And I loved that he was able to hone in on that truth because a lot of people can't see that they are different. I remember going to my therapist's office and being like, so what do I do next? And she's, well, you have two relationships. So there's actually separate decisions that need to be made. And the only decision you need to be making are the ones for you. I could not comprehend that statement for years. And I feel like Luke has a very strong background in coaching individuals who have experienced infidelity on both sides. So while he played the part of the person who was betrayed, he has also coached people who have been the betrayer. And I don't even like really assigning that label to people because I'm like, ultimately they betrayed themselves, not anybody else, if that was something that was important to them. The compromising of a value system is very complex and needs to be kind of untangled. That's what I tell people. They're like, what do you do for a living? I'm like, I help people untangle mental knots because these knots are suffocating their individual existence. But yeah, I think what
no
else can I
human
say
left
about Luke?
behind.
No human left behind.
We're going to get access for all of the men who are still here and still listening or new here and new listeners.
Yeah, absolutely.
Everybody help.
Get you the support you need to make decisions that you can feel really good about, and definitely giving you the support you need in an isolating experience in life. I heard this statement the other day about radicals, and I'm obsessed with the word radical. I use rad all the time, and radical doesn't necessarily mean extreme. Radical is someone who goes back to the source of traditions and collects the people who are on the outside of society to bring them in and remind them of what it's all about. And that really hit me. And I've probably listened to it. It's this one documentary that I'm obsessed with, and I've watched it probably too many times. But I loved that image of the radical being someone who is working to find the people who have been exiled by society and try to give them a place of support and community to see flourishing among humanity, ultimately. And I just like to make sure that everyone I align with in this business is aligned with that mindset. And I think that Luke is certainly one of those people. And I'm so privileged to have even encountered him and have the opportunity to have him see this business improve and become what it's meant to be.
Yeah, I'm very excited for the men's community because since opening up and telling people about the community, the amount of men that I've actually had be like, does she have one for us? And I'm working on it. We're working on it.
I felt like I was discriminating based on gender. And I was like, how can I make this? But ultimately, if I was a woman, whatever, inside of an affair, I wouldn't want to be disclosing my personal experiences of my infidelity with men. I feel more comfortable in disclosing that experience with women because I feel like I can relate to them more. And so I'm really just trying to stick with my own intuition on what needs to happen next within the business.
And if anybody is still here and is interested in looking up Luke Schilling's episode, if you go to the Apple Podcast, it's number 25.
Wow, you're so smart. I love you. Amazing. Well, thank you for listening to this week's episode, and we're excited to hear from you. Go ahead and send us anything. There are links in the show notes. And if you're interested in coaching, there's a link on my website. And if you have any interest in the men's community, go ahead and reach out, and we'll make sure to put you on the list of being notified when it is active.
Thank you so much for taking the time to listen to this podcast episode. We appreciate your support and would love to hear your thoughts on it. If you've made it this far, you're likely someone who is invested in the journey of being the other woman. We understand that this can be a difficult and complex experience, which is why we offer guided coaching to help you heal and move forward. We encourage you to explore the links in the episode description or visit theotherwomanandthewife.com/coaching to learn more about our exclusive coaching program and apply today. Thank you again for your support, and we look forward to seeing you in the next episode.